Hello, in this video I'm going to take you how to deploy Foundry Virtual Tabletop into Microsoft Azure using the Foundry Virtual Tabletop Azure Solution Accelerator. This open source repo I've hosted in GitHub will use the Azure Developer CLI, an open source tool from Microsoft that helps you to deploy repositories and solutions into Azure. It will help you do that in a really quick and easy way. If you're not familiar with Foundry Virtual Tabletop, it is a virtual tabletop you can use to host and run your virtual tabletop role-playing games or all sorts of games hosted in the cloud or on your local machine for local players to play. I prefer to host mine in the cloud because players are all over the place and it just makes sense for me as I have multiple Azure subscriptions. I'm very lucky. So I thought I'll show you how I can do it, how you can do it too, and how easy it is to get set up. So first thing you're going to need though is you will need to have purchased Foundry Virtual Tabletop. It's very affordable. It's a fantastic product. It's really, really great. I love it. It's so extensible. But once you have purchased it, you should have a username and password that you can log into Foundry Virtual Tabletop at foundryvtt.com. Now that's really important because we will need that username and password as part of the deployment process of our Foundry Virtual Tabletop into Azure. So just calling that out. Once we've actually deployed it, this is what we will get. In my case, I've deployed it into an Azure website. So this is an Azure web app. And I've created my Foundry Virtual Tabletop. I've named it DSR Foundry VTT AUE. You can call yours whatever you'd like, as long as it's unique. But I've deployed it, and I now have a full-on system, operational system with persistent storage, that works just like an one you would install locally, but it's in the cloud in whichever region I choose. So as you can see, I'm installing Dungeons & Dragons 5e game system into my Foundry, works perfectly and is persistent. But let's take a look at how to actually deploy it. So the first thing you're going to need to do is want to have a look at the repository where I store all this stuff. So I will share a link in the video for this. I'll also write a blog post and share the link in that. But you can see it is in my GitHub repo there. Now the first thing you want to do is just jump down into the deployment section. I will call out, you will have a couple of other prereqs that you need, obviously an Azure subscription. The subscription you have, you should have contributor and role-based access control administrator roles on that subscription because it obviously needs to deploy services into your Azure subscription, and it also needs to set some roles on those services so that it can deal with things like keys for your storage account and granting role-based access to things like the key vault that stores those keys. And finally, you'll need the Azure Developer CLI. If you're not familiar with the Azure Developer CLI, it is a command line tool which really allows you to both deploy solution accelerators like this, but also create your own. It's a fantastically powerful tool. You can any repository that has an Azure.yaml in the root folder usually is a solution accelerator that Azure Developer CLI can use. But in this case, we're going to assume you've deployed all those things, you've already got them ready, just as I have. And you just need to run a few commands to get things started. So we'll call out this process will take about 5 minutes, rough give or take, depending on the options you choose, but by default about 5 minutes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I actually just want to, we can do it that way, clone the repo, which takes a couple of seconds, and then change directories into that repository that I've just downloaded. Pretty simple. The next thing we're going to do is we actually, as I mentioned, we have to log into our Azure account or get the Azure Azure Developer CLI to actually log into our account. So we run azd auth login. That will pop up an Azure Microsoft authentication screen. We will then select our account we want to log in. And then we can close this, and that will have authenticated the Azure Developer CLI. So as you can see, it's told me I've logged in. What I'm now going to do is set some environment variables. So Azure Developer CLI has an ability for you to set or configure the deployment by setting environment variables. Now these are not normal environment variables, although they do work. You know, a normal environment variable does work. What we would usually do is run azd env set. Now I'm going to set a number 3 Foundry variables. These are really important. You need these. Whatever happens, there are many options, but you need these 3. So the first one is your Foundry username. That's what you log into the Foundry website. It uses that, this username and password. It stores it in a key vault securely when it deploys, but it uses the container that is actually used to run your Foundry VTT. That container uses it to retrieve your license file from Foundry itself. So we set, this is not my real username, by the way, so we set the username. Now the first time we do this, it's going to ask us for an unique environment name. So all of these, this solution accelerator is going to deploy a number of resources into Azure. All of those resources will have a naming pattern that uses this unique environment name. So if I called it my Foundry VTT, all the resources will have something to do with have my Foundry VTT in the username. And it will also be, that will be the URL that will be on the front of the azurewebsites.com. So myfoundryvtt.azurewebsites.com. Now that has to be globally unique. So don't just call it Foundry VTT. It's quite possible someone's already got that. I would say think of something a little bit more more unique to you. So I'm going to call this DSR Foundry 00. Let's make it 10. I've deployed a number of these in my time. So I've set my environment name, but now I've also got a couple of other settings I need to set. So the next ones I need to set my Foundry password, which is as password to my Foundry account on foundry.vtt.com. And I also need to set an admin key. Now that is the key that I will use to log into Foundry when it's deployed to enter setup, basically. So again, these are not real passwords. Use better ones than these, but I'm just using this to demonstrate. Once I've done that, all I need to do is type azd up. And it will next ask me, hey, in case I've got more than one subscription, I only have one, but say you had many, you can select the subscription. I'm just going to select the first one. Now it's going to say, well, where do you want to deploy it? I might deploy it I'll deploy it to US East 2. Just calling out, deploy this to wherever's closest to you and your players, especially if you're playing online. If your players are all over the place globally, you may choose to deploy somewhere that's sort of equidistance between you all. What I mean is just, avoid deploying to Europe if your players are in the US and vice versa, but sometimes you can't avoid it. So I'm actually based all the way down in New Zealand, so I could deploy in New Zealand, but hey, let's deploy to the East US. So this is going to take about 5 minutes. It's going to deploy a number of resources, does a number of tasks for us, but it automates the whole process. And at the end of it, we're going to end up with a URL showing how to access our new Foundry deployment. Now, we're not going to wait for this to happen. I've already deployed one here to show you exactly what it looks like. And as you can see, I deployed one to Australia East earlier. It goes through a process of deploying various parts of the environment. And then finally, at the end, it says, here's your new Foundry server. Now, I'd already deployed it, and this is the Foundry server that I actually had already deployed, and clearly it is working. It is based in Australia, and I can actually go and have a look at the resources or the services that were deployed as part of that. So when I deploy the solution accelerator, it creates me a resource group and a number of resources. Some of these resources we have to have. Some of them you can actually use settings, and they're documented in the repo, to turn them off if you don't want them. But by default, it will deploy Foundry Virtual Tabletop into an Azure web app. It will use an Azure storage account for the persistence layer. It actually uses files and shares that with using NFS with the container that is running inside that inside that web app. It also puts a key vault in, and that key vault is used to store your Foundry credentials securely, and also the storage account key, which the web app uses to connect to your storage account. It places all of that inside a virtual network so that all of the traffic between the web app, the key vault, and the storage account is all going over the virtual network, kept isolated from the public internet. This is possibly overkill for your average virtual tabletop deployment. You may not think it probably needs that level of security, but I like to do everything with Microsoft well-architected framework practices. And if you're not familiar with that, is a set of practices and patterns that Microsoft provides that shows you how to set things up in a secure, reliable, scalable, performant way, and meet all those best practices. I will of course also call out there's a number of other supporting resources, for example, the private endpoints that allow those services to connect to the virtual network, and the private DNS zones that provide DNS resolution to those services within the network. But if you're not familiar with Azure to that degree, don't worry too much about it. But finally, it'll also deploy an Azure Log Analytics. That is where all the diagnostic information, if you need to debug anything or see what's going on, but hopefully you'll never need to. As I said, you can set the settings as that you like and disable many of these things, including the virtual network, including the log analytics, so you can keep everything with a very basic install. There is one other option I'll call out, and that is the web app DDB proxy. So that is another web app. It's deployed into the same app service plan, so it shares the same compute and compute resource with the main Foundry Virtual Tabletop. This allows you to use a plugin in Foundry Virtual Tabletop, which is the D&D Beyond importer. And if you're not familiar with that, that is a fantastic plugin. Go donate to Mr. Primate. He's awesome. His work is fantastic. It allows you to, if you're using D&D Beyond, which I've got many books in D&D Beyond and much content, I want to be able to pull that into Foundry easily. This tool allows you to, this plugin allows you to do that, but you need a proxy to actually allow it to go and retrieve some of the information, things like monsters, to get that in. Totally optional, you don't need it, but I use it, so just calling that out, that is there for you. As I mentioned, these are web apps, but they're actually Linux containers. The Linux containers are actually provided, there's two of them. There's one for the VTT, Foundry VTT itself, and that is provided by Feldy in his Foundry VTT, his or her Foundry VTT Docker repo. It is fantastic, saves so much time, kept well up to date. All you need to do is know that this exists. You don't need to pay too much attention. Every time this Docker container gets updated, your web app will pull down the latest one when it restarts, and you'll upgrade to the latest Foundry. You can change that, but by default, I keep everything up to the latest. As I mentioned, the DDB proxy, that is also provided by Mr. Primate, as in this repo. Again, it's a Docker container, pretty straightforward. It just exposes a web URL, which provides basically a proxy into D&D Beyond to do that. There are a few setup instructions you do need to know when you've loaded Foundry, but that's all documented in the README that I have provided down here. So the settings I mentioned, there are quite a few of them. They're listed here. The configuration options, you know, your Foundry username, you can configure things like whether you want to deploy networking. You can change the storage. By default, it deploys to premium, 100 gigabytes of premium storage. I found that with some of my larger worlds, premium just works better, but you can use standard as well. You can disable public access to the storage account if you've, for example, when you place everything, all of those resources into a virtual network, it will disable public access to that storage account. So say you want to upload some files directly into the storage account, or maybe delete something out of your Foundry storage, you would need public access to be enabled. But by default, I turn it off. So if you want, change that setting to public access, storage public access to true, and it will allow you to access that storage account directly, but so will everyone else. So of course you've got to still authenticate, but it's just something to be aware of. There is a few other things. Azure Storage Resource Lock, that will put a lock on the storage account so you can't accidentally delete it. I highly recommend this for a production version. There is, by default, it deploys as a web app, but you can choose to deploy it as a container instance. I generally don't recommend this because most of the features aren't there. Virtual networking isn't there. You can't deploy a DDB. It doesn't support HTTPS. It's just there because that was the first way I did this. You can change the app service plan SKU to scale up or down or use a different SKU. There's now the P0 V4 in some regions, which is more performant than the P0 V3. So a good option, just not available on some. If you're using container instances, you get to configure the amount of memory and storage you have. If you do put put everything in a virtual network, you can deploy a Bastion host into that virtual network so that you can manage services within that virtual network. It's a bit overkill. I have never needed to use it. Prefer to just rely on the Azure Deploy diagnostics. So that is basically it. I will call out one other thing. This whole system was built using something called Azure Verified Modules. So the infrastructure as code is Bicep, but I use Azure Verified Modules in the Bicep to provide the fundamental building blocks of the resources. This is a really good idea for anyone building Bicep or Terraform to build any kind of Azure environment, because it is the best practices for, it includes all the best practices for deploying each resource type. You can have a look at this in detail. You can get there with aka ms/avm, but if you don't want to, you can just go to this URL above. Have a look at the resource modules. They're all versioned. The interesting thing is you actually just reference the link, the URL to where this module is stored and the version number, and your Bicep will pull that down and actually consume it. Just the best way to make sure you're using the best practices as outlined by Microsoft for deploying these services. So with that, that's pretty much it. Hopefully this is useful to someone. I'm going to post this video on YouTube. I then also plan to write a blog post to summarize this stuff up. It is a bit out of my normal content, which is really more AI focused, but I thought this is something I work on. I thought it might be somewhat useful to someone. And I'd just done a complete rework of it to update to AVM and Azure Developer CLI. So I thought, great time to share the work and hopefully get a few more people using Foundry Virtual Tabletop, which in my opinion is definitely the best way to run your local or remote D&D games or whatever role-playing game you choose. Well, I hope that's useful. Have a great day and thank you very much.